Welcome back to the TRM Show. I'm your host, Dave Serafinas. Today we have a special guest who I consider an academic. I've known him for maybe 15 years. He's very intelligent. Quite frankly, I can't keep up with him. Jeremy Horowitz is a strategic advisor to the corporate intelligence firm Interfor International and heads up Interfor Academy. He started his career overseas for a decade as a journalist based in Prague and Shanghai. Since returning to his native New York, Jeremy has worked mainly in corporate security. For the last 15 years, working on a wide variety of matters, including kidnap or ransom cases, background investigations, and executive protection details. He is the creator of Sell Like a Spy, a unique program that helps salespeople and executives to utilize spy tradecraft to improve their communication skills. Thanks for coming on the show, Jeremy. It's really nice to see you. How you been?
I've been well, Dave. Long time no see. It's great to be here and with you.
Yeah, good. So it's been a while. If I recall, we first met while you with Control Risks, and I, of course, was with International SOS. We did some projects together. You've done a lot since then. So let's start with China. Tell us about your experiences in China. How many years were you there, and what was your overall thoughts as it pertains to U.S. citizens living or working in China?
Yeah, well, there's just really so much to say about China, isn't there? I mean, it's funny. The first thing that came to mind was my experience was that when I came back to New York after a decade abroad, I spent basically 2 years in China, but the couple years prior, I was in and out of the region, living temporarily in China and Singapore and Hong Kong. So more or less like 4 years in and out. But most people ask me about my experience in China. I had spent 7 years prior in the Czech Republic. No one really cares about that as much unless they just want to hear stories about Prague, But the important side of things was the time in China. That meant a lot to my career. And look, it was fascinating. I learned so much, especially when I reflect now on that period with, almost 20 years behind me now of really closely watching China and having lived there. But at the time of living there, I can't say I loved living in China, especially considering how much I enjoyed living in the Czech Republic. So for instance, the first story I wrote as a journalist there was on driving in China. And because it was like a bizarro world where up was down and down was up. And, it was during a time in the mid 2000s when, there were tens of millions of people driving for the first time. Corruption was rampant, so people were bribing their instructors and they didn't really know how to drive. So you would see the craziest things like people reversing down off ramps to getting on a highway. Or my favorite was that when the light turned green, everybody going left would rush out and turn left and create a snarl of traffic of people going straight. And the pedestrians who had the stoplight or had the light to go would stop for these cars. So it just was, to me, that was an example of kind of the selfishness that was at the core of what was going on in China at the time, this sort of capitalism run amok, everybody just trying to go for theirs. And it was like capitalism overheating. That was kind of an observation I had there. But in terms of Americans living there at that time, especially, it was, ripe for opportunity. People starting businesses, buying properties, teaching English, it was really an incredible environment. And at that moment of time in China, the idea of China liberalizing through some of the influences of the West and Western businesses was still kind of, the doctrine of foreign policy. So, there was a lot, it was a freer moment in China. Even in the business press was a little bit more unfettered because the government allowed the press to go after corruption and bad business practices as a proxy so they wouldn't have to. So there was a lot of reason to be optimistic about China, and it was an exciting time. I think now, I haven't been back to China in a number of years, but, partially it's due to COVID and some things, but I think the atmosphere is quite different now in the third term of Xi Jinping and this moment that we're living through that I write about, pretty regularly in The Hill and in other places. It involves a pivot away from this sort of what seems to be a naive idea of the liberalizing of China. And now we're living through a pivot where there's a quasi Cold War going on with China. And America and the West, despite what you saw from the president of France this past week, are realizing that China has been, engaged in wholesale theft of intellectual property of Western businesses. The Chinese economic miracle is in large part built on that. And China has not been a fair and reasonable player on the international scene, not honoring, international forums, like the ones that have been findings against it in the South China Sea and many other examples. So there's a major change going on in foreign policy. I don't know that it affects the business traveler going to China day to day as much. I think if you're a traveler, it's incumbent upon you to, when you're traveling overseas, to keep up with what's going on in the news. So, in knowing China, you have to realize this is a country that nationalism is a major tool that the government uses to create cohesiveness. So I raise that because monitoring the news about where you're traveling is so important because, in the late 90s, the U.S. was involved in, what was going on in Kosovo, and it bombed Sarajevo. And there was a mistake where a bomb landed on the Chinese embassy. And China erupted into nationalist fury against America. And it was quite dangerous if you're an American at that time. So, in this fraud environment, whether it's the spy balloon or, a spy plane of the U.S., encountering something in the South China Sea, it's important for any business traveler to closely monitor the news to make sure you're not swept up in some anti-American situation if there's a fast-moving development. Yeah. The other thing about risk in business travel in China, and this is not, news to some of the savvy people who listen to your podcast, but, intellectual property theft, as I mentioned, is just rampant. So savvy business travelers have taken burner phones to China, have taken laptops with bare bones details on it. Because if your business is part of the Chinese government's strategic priorities, you should expect that the Chinese will try to hack into your phone or computer. Who knows if they will, but it's good practice for any business traveler to act like they're going to be the target for corporate espionage and to take steps to, take some risk mitigation steps, essentially. So I hope that I'm rambling on here a little bit, Dave, but I hope that's a bit of an...
No, that's very, very good points. I know from working with clients, a lot of times they'll send their travelers along with clean laptops just to make sure there's no IP theft there. But those are really, really good points. A lot of business travelers, perhaps they're in sales or what have you, and they're going along life with a Coke and a smile, and they have no idea what's going on around them, right? You've seen it a million times,
Right.
And everybody sees the news and they feel the tension, but, they really need to pay attention to what's going on, like you said, and just don't do anything that's going to cause any problems for yourself, because that's not the place to have problems, right?
Yeah. And especially, I think it's important for a business traveler to, if you're a man and you're going over there and you're, having drinks at a bar and you're, flirting with girls, don't lose sight of the fact that I tell people too that China, because of the one-child policy, is really skewed towards a male population. There's too many men and not enough women. Mm-hmm. And making sure that you're culturally sensitive and not being boorish is important, because I know in many cases when Western men have acted in inappropriate ways and been physically assaulted or been heavily intimidated. So make sure if you go to China, you keep those details in mind.
Yeah, I would say that pertains to any other country other than your home country, right? Don't act like an idiot.
It's particularly strong in China with the nationalism, the anti-Americanism, and then the skewed ratio of men to women. So, right. But yeah, good idea for any traveler to not be the ugly American or just not to be a boorish lout when you're out.